It was one of those Oxford mornings when the air carries no warmth, only a faint dampness that clings to your coat and insists you remember where you are. I had risen too early for no reason other than the emptiness of sleep, and walked towards the Bodleian, half imagining that I might find the world rearranged overnight. Instead, I found nothing changed. The great doors were still locked, the pigeons still quarrelled under the eaves, and the stones still seemed to guard their centuries of whispered confidence. Strange, the way silence can sharpen the mind, or rather, how it can trouble it into motion. I had stood on the cobbles thinking of a crossword clue I had left unfinished the night before. 4 across the sound of absence. 6, I had written the obvious silence and felt dissatisfied, as if silence were too easy, too naked. And yet that was precisely it. What word fits better than the one that refuses adornment? Lewis arrived at my side without announcement. He has that gift, the ability to appear just as one's thoughts grow stale. He asked what I was doing, and I replied that I was listening. To what, he asked, to what is not there? He shook his head in the way he always did when he suspected I was drifting dangerously close to indulgence. We were there for the college porter, who had summoned us in a voice that carried worry without admitting it. A fellow had failed to rise for his morning lecture. An ordinary occurrence, perhaps, but in Oxford ordinariness rarely remains untouched for long. The porter had knocked, and finding no answer, had allowed himself in. A room in disarray, he said, but not in the manner of a student. Books overturned, papers scattered, a chair tipped to the floor. What disturbed him most was the quiet. No sounds from the street disturbed it, no rustle of curtain or clink of glass. When I entered the set of rooms, I noticed first the absence of a clock. Most dons I had known prized timepieces almost as much as texts, yet here the mantel was bare. A small impression of dust marked where something had once rested. Why remove it? Why erase the marker of time's passage unless time itself had become unbearable? Lewis muttered something about burglary. I heard the doubt in his tone even before he spoke it. A burglar would not take a clock of modest value and leave a shelf of editions worth more than the porter's annual wage. It was the kind of disturbance that sought to imitate chaos without ever achieving it. On the desk lay a single sheet of graph paper, half filled with notations in neat black ink. Equations, partial and fragmentary without context. Numbers written as though to convince their author of something unsayable. The mathematics of silence, I thought. A way of proving that absence can be measured, that nothing has weight if you dare to weigh it. Lewis bent to pick up a book from the floor. Milton, Paradise Lost. Always the same story, always the same fall. I told him to leave it be. Books fall easily, people do not. We spoke to no one else that morning. The college was still yawning itself awake, its undergraduates still nursing their hangovers or their essays. I asked the porter when he had last heard the missing man's voice. He could not say. A few days, perhaps. He remembered only the absence, the silence along the stairwell, the door that remained closed, the lack of complaints from neighbours who usually complained about everything. I looked again at the sheet of equations. A small smudge marked the lower corner, as if a damp thumb had pressed against the ink before it dried. Someone had held it longer than necessary, as though unwilling to let go. Lewis suggested we call it formally and set the wheels in motion. I told him we would, but not yet. There was something here that required patience, the kind of patience silence teaches. He frowned, but said nothing further. As we left, I could not resist glancing once more at the mantel. The dust line where the clock had stood remained more eloquent than anything else in that room. Some lives leave their traces not in what is present, but in what has been carefully removed. I told myself that was where we must begin. With what is missing. With the sound of absence. 6 letters. Silence. The news reached me, not through urgency, but with the weariness of inevitability. A scholar had been found dead in his rooms. The porter's voice over the telephone had carried neither shock nor sorrow, only that hollow resonance which comes when one has rehearsed the phrase too often in one's head before allowing it out. By the time I arrived, the college quadrangle was already sealed in that peculiar hush which descends when death takes residence among ancient stones. Rain had begun to stipple the flagstones, darkening the already dark. Students hurried by with lowered heads, feigning ignorance, yet I could feel their eyes flitting back once they thought themselves unobserved. Death in a place dedicated to knowledge has always seemed, to me, more obscene than elsewhere. Perhaps because it mocks the illusion that learning can insulate us from the old, unsentimental truths. The fellow lay upon the carpet between desk and hearth. The fire had long since died, leaving only a faint shell clinging to the air. His body was turned slightly onto its side, one arm crooked beneath him, as though he had stumbled forward and sought to steady himself on the way down. No blood, no wound apparent, nothing but the strangely peaceful mask of a face that ought to have been full of argument, still. Lewis stood at the window, his hands sunk in the pockets of his mac. He spoke low, telling me it was the porter who had discovered him after knocking twice. No answer. The door unlatched, the scene before us. I asked what time, though I knew already by the rhythm of the day just before the chapel bell, when silence had not yet yielded to noise. The room had a neatness to it, though not the kind that comes from order. More the neatness of someone who has nothing left to arrange. Books closed, ink capped, letters stacked but not sent. There was a plate with the remnants of bread and a glass half drained. The wine within it had lost its brightness, congealed to that unappetizing colour which lies somewhere between rust and regret. I bent beside the desk. A notebook lay open at a page filled with annotations in the margin of a Latin text. The hand was tidy, but the final note trailed away mid-sentence, as though the pen had fallen from a hand unwilling to obey its owner. Lewis muttered it looked like heart failure. Perhaps it was. Most deaths, after all, require no assistance from outside. And yet I found myself searching the surfaces, the corners, the silences between objects. There was one detail, a candlestick on the mantelpiece, its wax hardened in a sudden slope, as though extinguished in haste. Why light a candle at all when the electric lamps worked fine? Unless one desired a more private sort of illumination, less revealing, more forgiving. I spoke with the porter later in the passageway. He said the scholar had kept largely to himself these past weeks. Few visitors, fewer words. At Hall he had eaten sparingly, sometimes not at all. The porter remembered only the sound of him pacing up and down, as if marking time with his steps. I tried to recall the man in question. We had crossed paths once or twice at lectures, a gaunt figure in threadbare tweeds, a voice that spoke sparingly but with weight. I remembered that he favoured crosswords during intervals, and that once he had leaned over to remark that the clue, mortal certainty 5, could only be fatal. Fatal. 5 letters. I wondered if he had solved it then, or if the clue had been solved for him in the stillness of this room. Lewis asked whether we should call the coroner immediately. I said we should, though my eyes remained on the wax of the candle, the interrupted sentence, the dustless square on the shelf where something had been removed not long ago. A clock, perhaps, or something smaller. Some absences cannot be explained by tidiness alone. We left the room as we had found it, except for our footprints in the carpet. Outside, The rain had become steadier, drumming its slow rhythm upon the quadrangle. I could not shake the feeling that we were walking not into the beginning of a case, but into its echo. As though the true story had already been written, and we were condemned to read only its margin notes. The scholar lay silent behind us, and silence, I thought, was the most eloquent evidence of all. I returned to the rooms the following afternoon, though I could have recited them from memory. It is a flaw of mine, the inability to leave silence unexamined. Where others might have been content with a verdict of natural causes, I felt the disturbance of an unfinished sentence, as if the air itself demanded correction. The curtains had been drawn back by then, letting the pale Oxford light touch the desk where the scattered papers still rested. Equations, carefully inked, half crossed through, half completed. There is something unnerving about numbers abandoned mid-thought, as though the logic of the universe itself had been interrupted. Lewis watched me as I traced one equation with my finger. He asked if I understood any of it. I told him I understood only that it was meant to lead somewhere and had not. He laughed softly, then stopped when he saw I was serious. I bent lower to the page, noticing the faintest indentation of another line beneath the ink, almost erased, then written over. Not a mistake, but an attempt to hide the route once taken. Mathematicians are rarely so cautious. They live by their errors, proud to show the detours as well as the triumphs. Here, someone had wanted concealment. I asked Lewis if he had noticed the echo. He looked at me blankly. I tapped the surface of the desk with the flat of my hand. It rang hollow. A drawer removed, or perhaps a board lifted. He crouched beside me and tried the lower panels, but they held firm. I told him not to force it. Some things open only when they wish to be found. In the stairwell below, I heard the faint voice of the porter speaking to another fellow, their words blurred by distance but coloured by unease. I imagined the rumours already taking shape. A lonely man, an overworked mind, a weak heart. Rumour is Oxford's most fluent language, and it never fails to supply an explanation where evidence hesitates. I lit the electric lamp, though the sun was not yet gone. The light revealed a pattern on the mantelpiece, faint but unmistakable. Two outlines in dust, side by side, as if twin objects had once stood there. I asked Lewis what he thought might have been removed. He said candlesticks, perhaps, or photographs. I asked why. Then the remaining candlestick was single and unpaired, and why no frames of any kind could be seen elsewhere in the room. He frowned, as if irritated by my insistence on such trivialities. Equations and echoes, that was all the room offered. And yet it was enough. A missing clock, a smudged thumbprint on a page, the absence of photographs, the half-erased line of mathematics. Each detail small enough to be overlooked, together forming a silence that grew heavier the longer I stood among them. Lewis spoke again, this time asking whether I believed the man had taken his own life. I said I did not know, but if he had done so with curious discretion. No letter, no farewell, only numbers halted mid-thought. Most who choose to end their days cannot resist one final statement. This man, if he had resisted entirely. That to me was more suspicious than any open declaration. I walked once more to the window. The rain had ceased, leaving the quadrangle washed clean, the stone glistening faintly in the late light. Students crossed in pairs, their laughter incongruous, a sound too light for the gravity above them. I envied them for their ignorance, their faith in the continuity of things. As we left the rooms, I paused at the threshold. There was a faint creak beneath my foot, one step more resonant than the rest. I glanced down, a board slightly raised, almost imperceptible, as though the floor itself wished to betray a secret. I told Lewis nothing, not yet. Some truths prefer to remain half hidden until the silence grows unbearable. We closed the door behind us. The echo followed. The senior common room smelled of coffee and damp wool, a place where one expected the gentle rustle of newspaper pages, the scrape of chairs on polished oak, the occasional cough muffled in a handkerchief. That afternoon, however, it carried a sharper atmosphere, as though everyone present had dressed not for tea, but for cross-examination. I sat with Lewis in the corner, half concealed behind a copy of the Times that neither of us pretended to read. 3 fellows in gowns occupied the table opposite, their voices low yet deliberate, as though speaking for my benefit. I had always found it curious, the way scholars in Oxford could talk of murder in the same tone they discussed Milton or Newtonian academic exercise, safe in the assurance that tragedy belonged to someone else. One of them, a tall man with the stoop of long hours bent over manuscripts, remarked that our dead colleague had seemed increasingly withdrawn. He recalled the porter saying he rarely attended hall, never joined them in the SCR. Another fellow, younger, added that the man's research had stalled. Equations, yes, but without end or application, a mind circling itself like a dog in a too-small yard. I asked quietly whether the dead man had enemies. The tall one looked over, startled, as if he had not noticed me listening. Enemies! No more than any don acquires after 20 years of disputing footnotes. The laughter that followed was thin and unconvincing. Lewis leaned closer to me later and muttered that scholars made poor liars. I replied that they made excellent ones. They simply disguised their falsehoods as digressions. As the afternoon waned, I allowed myself a question to the youngest of the 3. Has he ever visited the dead man's rooms? Only once, he said, to return a volume borrowed from the library. He thought it strange, though, that the shelves contained so many books unopened, their spines increased, as if they were purchased not to be read, but to be seen. And here was a small deduction. A man who fills his shelves with books unread seeks not knowledge but cover, for what we could not yet say. But the detail remained with me, more insistent than the words exchanged around the table. The master entered then, and silence spread with his arrival. He was one of those figures who absorbed light rather than reflected it, his gown flowing behind him like a black tide. He greeted us politely, too politely, and asked whether progress had been made. I answered with a question of my own. Had he noticed anything missing from the deceased's rooms? The master paused, fingers on the lapel of his gown, and then replied that he had not entered those rooms in years. His concern was for the college, he said, not for personal spaces. Yet I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, no more than a breath. Later, as Lewis and I walked across the quad, he asked what I had made of it all. I told him I had made little, except for one thing, the gowns themselves. Each man had worn his as if it were armor. There is comfort in costume, in the anonymity it lends. A murderer in a gown looks no different from a philosopher in a gown. That was the difficulty and perhaps the point. We paused by the chapel, the rain beginning again with that peculiar Oxford insistence, neither heavy nor light, simply continuous. Lewis asked if I believed one of them had done it. I said I believed nothing yet except that silence and absence are rarely natural. He frowned, unused to answers that gave no direction. I thought then of a crossword clue I had abandoned that morning. Gown conceals identity 7. The answer had eluded me, though now it seemed obvious. Masking. 7 letters. It was what they all wore in one fashion or another. The college bell tolled the hour. The sound echoed across the stones, across the river, into the corners of rooms where dust gathered and secrets clung. I knew the investigation had not yet begun in earnest. The scholars in their gowns had given me only fragments, yet fragments have a way of arranging themselves into a pattern when one is patient enough to wait. And patience, though I have often lacked it in life, has always been forced upon me in death. It was evening when I found myself back in the senior common room, the light from the high windows sinking into a bruised violet. Conversations drifted like smoke, half-formed curling, then dissipating when anyone noticed my listening ear. I had always felt that Oxford was a city of quotations men and women, repeating the dead in order to disguise their own hesitations. One of the younger dons, too eager, too certain of his cleverness, was speaking of our deceased scholar. He quoted, or thought he did, from Eliot, "Between the motion and the act falls the shadow." But he altered it. He said silence, not shadow. I let it pass in the moment, but the error struck me like a faint chime in a quiet church. Silence where there should have been shadow. Silence again creeping into every corner of this case. Later, when the room had thinned off its occupants, I asked him where he had learned his line. From a book, he said. He could not recall which. I told him it was a common mistake, yet he bristled, insisting he was right. There it was, vanity masquerading as knowledge. And vanity, I reminded myself, is a form of weakness. Lewis looked at me afterwards with the expression of a man who knows I am chasing ghosts. He asked if a misquoted poet mattered when a man lay dead. I told him that words mattered more than bodies sometimes. He shook his head, muttering that I liked to make life difficult. We walked back through the rain-slicked cloisters. I noticed the small pools of water that gathered beneath the dripping stone arches, perfect circles widening, breaking, then vanishing. Every drop carried the sound of persistence, of something unwilling to be ignored. It reminded me of the graph paper on the scholar's desk, the circles of logic left unfinished. I thought again of his equations, not as mathematics, but as echoes of repeated attempts to grasp a truth he could never quite articulate. That night, I returned alone to the library. It was nearly empty, the silence interrupted only by the soft shuffle of the librarian somewhere in the distance. I found Eliot's poems in their thin, grey binding. There it was, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow. Shadow, not silence. I traced the line with my finger, as though it were a wound. It was not the misquotation itself that mattered, but what it revealed was that someone had been speaking of the dead man before his death, borrowing words but bending them to suit a private meaning. I could not yet say what it meant, but I felt its weight. On my way out, I paused at the library desk. A register lay open, each name signed in the same faint ink. The deceased scholar had last borrowed a volume 2 weeks before. Title, On the Mathematics of Harmony. The book was missing from the shelf. It had not been returned. Harmony and silence, 2 words, so often confused yet rarely mistaken by a man who knew both music and mathematics. Lewis found me outside, cigarette in hand, and asked whether I was chasing poetry when we ought to be chasing people. I told him that poetry and people were the same thing, one could not be understood without the other. He groaned as if I had condemned him to another sleepless night, and stubbed his cigarette against the wet stone. A small deduction came to me as we walked. The scholar had not lived among books unread. He had lived among books too carefully chosen, no random scatter, no indulgent novels tucked between the mathematics. Each volume was deliberate, each spine rehearsed. It was the collection of a man building a mask from pages, and masks, I thought, conceal more than faces. Back in my room, I poured myself a whiskey and tried to fill in the crossword. 9 down poet, wrongly quoted, 5. The answer came with an almost mocking clarity. Eliot, 5 letters, wrongly quoted indeed, and as the whiskey burned its way into silence, I realized I was not reading a case at all. I was reading a misquotation of a case. Someone had altered the line, shifted the emphasis, replaced shadow with silence. And the truth, whatever it was, still waited in that substitution. The bells had always unsettled me, perhaps because they belonged to no one, yet dictate the movements of everyone. On that particular morning, I stood beneath the college tower as the hour was struck, each peal vibrating through stone and marrow alike. Lewis remarked that the sound was late, a few minutes by his watch. I told him that in Oxford, time is as variable as truth. Both depend upon who is observing. We had come to inspect the tower at my insistence rather than his. The deceased scholar had often walked here, the porter told me, taking his exercise in slow circles beneath the shadow of the bells. I wanted to see what he might have seen, hear what he might have heard. The stairwell up was narrow, spiraled, and smelt of chalk and mildew. Our footsteps produced that hollow resonance unique to places where few feet have trod. At the summit, the bells loomed above us like silent jurors. I found the mathematician's touch are everywhere small chalk markings on the stone ledge, smudged but still legible. Equations again, though reduced now to fragments, as if he had been testing symmetry against the rhythm of sound. Lewis asked what they meant. I said they meant nothing, or everything. It depended on whether you believed numbers could explain bells, or bells could explain numbers. The wind at that height carried a chill that worked its way through the coat. I leaned on the parapet, looking across the rooftops. Oxford lay stretched beneath, as intricate and indecipherable as a crossword grid, a clue half written in stone, half erased by rain. And like every crossword, there were crossings, one answer depending on another, nothing solved in isolation. Lewis pointed to the chalk again. He thought it resembled a child's game, squares and circles joined by lines. Perhaps it was. But I saw something else. The notation formed almost a rhythm, a pattern of intervals, as though the man had attempted to transcribe the tolling of the bells into algebra. Between each strike, a pause. Between each pause, an absence. An absence had been the theme of his final weeks. Descending, I noticed one detail that made me pause. Halfway down, a window opened onto the quad. The sill was marked with a faint smear, the outline of a hand resting too long. Not dust, disturbed by chance, but the kind of pressure left by someone leaning, waiting. A gesture easily overlooked, unless one asked why a man should stop here rather than climb all the way down. Back in the quadrangle, the porter awaited us, nervous, as though the tower itself were guilty. He said the scholar often carried a notebook up with him. He would sit against the cold stone, scribbling until the bells rang, then descend in silence. Did anyone ever join him? The porter shook his head, but once, he said, he heard voices drifting from above. Two men, not one. He could not identify the other. That detail he offered reluctantly, as though fearing it would implicate him in something larger than duty. Lewis muttered afterwards that porters remembered too much when it suited them. I agreed, but it was the kind of memory that wears the shape of truth, however faint. That evening, back in my room, I unfolded the crossword. 7 down, ringing structure 9. The obvious answer was bell tower. Yet I hesitated, pencil hovering, because I thought of the scholar's equations, the smudges, the pauses. The true answer was not the structure, but the interval it created. What lies between sounds? What lingers after it? Echo. I poured myself a whiskey and listened as the bells struck again in the distance. Each note followed by silence, each silence heavy with suggestion. Somewhere in those intervals lay the reason a man had filled his margins with half-erased numbers, had withdrawn into absence, had misquoted poets and left books unread. The bells ended. The silence, as always, remained. There are moments in any investigation when the pieces appear to align, and one is tempted to accept the pattern for what it seems to be. That afternoon I very nearly surrendered to such temptation. Lewis had returned from the coroner's office with what he believed a decisive conclusion. Heart failure, plain and unembellished. The man had died naturally, as men die every day, in libraries and beds and stations without notice. Lewis's voice carried the weight of relief, for he dislikes ambiguity the way I dislike certainty. I listened, sipping a whiskey I had poured earlier than I ought, and told him he was probably right. I do not think he caught the hesitation in my tone. The file contained all the usual details: weight, age, condition of the heart, absence of wounds. Nothing to disturb the notion of a lonely scholar collapsing in his rooms, and yet as I read I noticed what was not written: no mention of the missing clock, no record of the half-erased equations, no acknowledgement of the silence that had settled weeks before his death. To others, irrelevancies; to me, the texture of truth. Lewis remarked that we ought to close the matter. I asked him if he had ever solved a crossword with an answer that fit perfectly, and yet left him unsatisfied. He laughed, saying I could find dissatisfaction in a pint of beer. Perhaps. But I told him that sometimes an answer appears correct, only because one forces it into the grid. A false solution, neat on paper but empty in meaning. Later that evening I found myself walking through the rain-soaked streets, my coat clinging to me, the cobblestones glistening under the lamps. Oxford after dark has always resembled a palimpsest, the present written over the past, never quite erasing it. I thought of the scholar pacing beneath the bell tower, his chalk marks washed into ghostly lines by rain. A man does not inscribe equations on stone unless he is seeking something larger than proof. He was listening, I told myself. Listening for a pattern no one else could hear. I returned to his room once more. They had been tidied now, the bed stripped, the shelves dusted. Death is efficient. It clears away quickly what the living hesitate to touch. Only the desk remained untouched, the graph paper with its notations still spread across it. I bent close, tracing one equation I had dismissed before. It resembled, I realized, the intervals of a bell sequence, the pauses transcribed as numbers. He had not been writing mathematics at all. He had been translating sound into silence. And then a memory returned the misquoted poet. Between the motion and the act falls the silence, a false quotation, as false as the coroner's neat solution. Someone else had spoken those words before me, altering them as if to guide the narrative, a scholar dead of natural causes, his eccentricities dismissed as harmless. A closed case, clean and untroubling. But the smear on the tower window still haunted me. The missing clock, the absent photographs, the deliberate erasure of lines in the notebook, too many gaps, too much absence. Absence itself had become the evidence. Lewis asked me once more, later that night, whether I believed it was murder. I told him I believed it was not heart failure. That was all I could say. He sighed, weary, perhaps regretting ever agreeing to walk Oxford's corridors with me. Back in my room, I took out the crossword again. 12 across misleading answer, 5.9. I filled it in at last false solution. 5, 9. Exactly the phrase that had been circling my mind all day. The letters slotted into place with that satisfying precision only a crossword can deliver. And yet, unlike the coroner's verdict, this answer carried unease rather than reassurance. For in a crossword, a false solution misleads only the solver. In life, it conceals the truth entirely. I finished the whiskey and let the silence grow. Outside, the bells tolled, late again, by a few minutes. Between the motion and the act, between the sound and the silence, something remained unanswered. And it would not let me go. The porter gave me the key reluctantly, as though handing over a relic that might curse the one who carried it. By then the scholars' rooms had been emptied of their immediate sorrows, bed linen stripped, clothes folded into anonymous trunks, the faint odour of disinfectant clinging to the air. But I knew enough of Oxford to believe that nothing is ever fully erased. Lewis muttered that there was little left to find. He had the coroner's verdict in his pocket and a sigh on his lips. Yet I asked him to humour me. We moved through the rooms in silence, each floorboard announcing us, each creaking like a reminder that the dead had once heard the same sound beneath their own steps. I sat at the desk, where the papers had been tidied into a semblance of order. Graph paper again, each sheet a fragment of thought abandoned mid-flight. I lifted them one by one, searching for what I did not know until I found a sheet slightly thicker than the others, its edge curling as though resisting concealment. Between two leaves of mathematics lay another page, carefully pressed flat, almost hidden. It was not an equation, it was prose, written in a hand more hurried than the neat script surrounding it, a passage in Latin, faintly smudged, as if copied from another text. I read aloud, my voice low, translating as I went. In silence the truth is revealed, yet in silence it may also be concealed. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I was not sure, but I felt the weight of its placement hidden between numbers, as though the scholar had known the language of mathematics would be examined, but his true words overlooked. Lewis shrugged. A note of philosophy, nothing more. I did not argue, but the detail troubled me, the deliberate concealment, the decision to bury words where only accident or obsession might find them. It spoke not of despair, but of intent. I placed the hidden page beside the equations and noticed something else faint, indentations across the margins, the ghost of erased sentences. I tilted the sheet to the light, and there it was, a phrase half legible, repeated several times before being rubbed away. The word bell appeared, then something I could not decipher, then silence. Lewis asked if I meant to treat a smudge of pencil as evidence. I reminded him that smudges were often the truest part of writing. He said nothing, but the furrow in his brow deepened. We left the desk and turned to the shelves. The books remained as the porter had described, impressive, deliberate, almost theatrical in their arrangement. My hand traced the spines until it fell on a slim volume out of alignment. I pulled it free. Inside, a page had been cut away, leaving a jagged edge where the knife had slipped. A missing page in a book already unread, a hidden page in a notebook, echoes of absence, each repeating the other. Lewis swore softly. He asked why anyone would cut a page from a book. I replied that sometimes what is missing says more than what remains. When we left the rooms, dusk had begun to settle over the quadrangle. The rain had paused, leaving the air sharp with that mineral scent Oxford stones release only when wet. I heard the bell tower strike the hour, each note lingering, fading, then swallowed by silence. Back in my own rooms later, I unfolded the crossword. 16 down concealed leaf. 6. The answer seemed almost mocking hidden. 6 letters, exactly what I had found, exactly what remained unsolved. I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at the word until the letters blurred. I could not decide whether the scholar had left the page for me to find, or whether I had intruded upon something never meant for another's eyes. Either way, it was too late. Once a hidden page is discovered, it cannot be restored to secrecy. And secrecy, I thought, was the true architecture of Oxford, not its towers, not its libraries, but the silence in which one truth is written and another erased. It was Lewis who found it, though he never claimed the credit. We had returned to the college library, more from habit than expectation, when he tugged a thin envelope from the back of a ledger. He passed it to me without comment, his face unreadable in the weak light. Inside lay a single photograph, black and white, the edges frayed with age. The image showed a choir assembled on the chapel steps, rows of boys in surplices, faces upturned towards the lens, a scattering of dots at the edges. The dead scholar was there, younger, hair still dark, mouth set in a line of uneasy discipline. His gaze did not meet the camera, but turned slightly aside, towards another figure, half obscured at the margin. That, more than anything else, held my attention. Lewis asked if it meant anything. I told him it meant everything, or perhaps nothing, but I asked him to look again. Did he see the man at the edge? Lewis squinted, shook his head. He said it was too blurred, too faint to matter. Yet I could not ignore the line of sight of the scholar's eyes, drawn not to the centre of the moment, but to its periphery. People reveal themselves not by what they look at, but by what they avoid. I slipped the photograph back into its envelope and felt the slight roughness of the paper, as though it had been handled too often, fingers worrying at the edges. This was no forgotten relic. Someone had kept it hidden, and someone had looked at it more than once. That evening I asked the porter about the choir. He said the college had disbanded it years ago when funding dwindled and enthusiasm faltered. He remembered the photograph, though he had seen it once in the master's study. The master, he added with a peculiar hesitation, had sung in that choir as a boy. His memory was fallible, he admitted, but not, I thought, entirely untrustworthy. Lewis frowned at this. He disliked connections drawn from shadows and photographs. He preferred facts that could be catalogued, checked, confirmed. I told him that a photograph was sometimes more reliable than memory, and sometimes less. It depended not on the image, but on the silences it preserved. Back in my room later, I spread the photograph beside the crossword. 18 across, picture conceals truth. 9, I hesitated, pencil poised, before writing a photograph, 9 letters. Yet I left the square incomplete, as if the answer mocked me. For photographs conceal nothing. They merely reveal what we do not yet know how to read. I studied the scholar's face again. He seemed ill at ease even then, long before his equations, long before his silence. The faint tilt of his shoulders, the set of his mouth, the turned glance, they were the posture of a man already wary of the world around him. And that blurred figure at the margin, a shadow, a presence, a possibility. Was it the same man whose voice the porter had once overheard in the bell tower? Or was I, as Lewis feared, chasing echoes into nothingness? I poured myself a whisky and listened to the rain against the window. Oxford was dark outside, the streets reflecting lamplight like veins of broken glass. Somewhere the bells marked the hour, late again, their sound carrying across stone and water. I thought of the scholar sitting beneath them, notebook in hand, listening not to the toll, but to the silence between each strike. I thought of the hidden page, the cut leaf, the erased words, and now this photograph. Lewis had asked me earlier if I believed the man at the edge was important. I told him that importance is rarely found at the centre. It lingers in the margins, in what others fail to see. He sighed, lighting another cigarette, muttering that I was too fond of puzzles. Perhaps I was, but puzzles, unlike people, at least admit there is a solution. I placed the photograph back in its envelope and locked it in my desk, not to preserve it, but to silence it. Some images speak louder than words, and this one had already said too much. Still as I lay awake that night, I could not forget the scholar's turned gaze, fixed forever on the blurred figure at the edge of the choir. A glance preserved in silver nitrate, a secret caught between light and shadow. And I knew then that photographs, like equations, are only another way of measuring silence. There are few things I dislike more than being led astray, though I must admit it happens to me often enough. The first red herring had been the coroner's verdict, neat and untroubling, a solution designed to be swallowed without question. The second revealed itself more insidiously, disguised as clarity, arriving with all the charm of certainty before collapsing in my hands like wet paper. It began with the photograph. Word had spread that we had found it, though I had told almost no one. Oxford thrives on rumour that secrets in this city travel more quickly than truth. The master himself summoned me, requesting, though it sounded more like demanding, to see the image. His eyes lingered on the blurred figure at the margin. He said it was a choir boy he dimly remembered, long since gone, irrelevant to our concerns. He said it too quickly and with the air of a man rehearsing an answer long before the question had been asked. Lewis was inclined to take him at his word. He argued that the scholar's turned gaze could be no more than chance, the random tilt of a head caught at the wrong moment. I told him there is no such thing as chance in a photograph. Every glance is frozen in tension, preserved without mercy. He shrugged, suggesting that perhaps I saw what I wished to see. And perhaps I did. That night I walked across the quad, alone, the rain making a mirror of the stones. I paused beneath the bell tower, listening for the sound of footsteps, convinced I heard them above me. When I climbed the stairs, breathless with irritation more than exertion, the tower was empty. Only the chalk marks remained, paler now, dissolving into the stone. It was the librarian who offered the second red herring. She brought me a ledger, a list of borrowed volumes, her finger landing on the title that had vanished from the shelf on the Mathematics of Harmony. It had been signed out by the scholar and not returned. She leaned close, her voice almost conspiratorial, to tell me she believed the book contained a coded confession. She had read it once, years ago, and remembered it spoke of symmetry, proportion, the equilibrium of opposites. She was certain he had been leaving us a message in numbers. For a moment I wanted to believe her. It had the elegance of a story one might tell oneself in the quiet of a lonely man leaving behind a hidden cipher, his death less an accident than a puzzle. But then I remembered the hidden page, the erased lines, the cut leaf, the photograph. Too many fragments, too many silences. Harmony was not what he had left us. Discord was closer to the mark. Lewis asked me later if the book mattered. I told him it mattered precisely because it did not. That was the second red herring, a distraction by inclusion, not exclusion. The scholar had borrowed the volume, yes, but only to give the impression of significance. He had relied on our hunger for meaning, knowing we would leap at the bait. And we had. We sat together in the common room, the fire low, the smell of damp coats heavy in the air. Lewis asked if I was certain. I told him certainty was for clerks, and what we had was silence, absence, and a photograph of a man looking away. He frowned, saying I was too fond of absences. I replied that absences are often more eloquent than presences. He had no answer to that. Later, alone, I opened the crossword. 21 down, misleading clue. 7, I smiled at the coincidence before writing herring. 7 letters, a clue about itself, a false lead, hidden in plain sight. Exactly what the scholar had left us, not once but twice. I stared at the word until it blurred on the page. The bells rang again, late as ever, each note followed by silence. The city settled into darkness, and I wondered whether we were any nearer the truth or simply circling within its echoes, mistaking every shadow for substance. The second red herring lay discarded, yet the taste of it lingered. There are nights when Oxford seems to withhold its secrets deliberately, as though each stone had conspired against revelation. That evening, however, the city felt looser, the silence thinner, as if something long pressed down had at last shifted. Lewis and I had returned to the rooms one final time, though neither of us confessed why. The scholar's belongings had been cleared away, his desk stripped of papers, his shelves diminished to the ordinary litter of student editions. Yet even absence leaves traces. The air still smelt faintly of dust warmed by lamplight, of chalk rubbed against stone. I walked slowly through the set, unwilling to admit that this was the last time. Lewis asked, half weary, half hopeful, if we were finished. I told him that finished was a word, best left to mathematicians. He laughed, not kindly, and lit another cigarette by the window. The smoke rose in pale spirals against the pane, each curl fading into the dusk. I asked him if he heard the bells. He said he always heard them. I asked if he noticed their lateness. He said he had stopped caring. But lateness, I told him, is also a form of proof. He frowned as though I had spoken in riddles, and perhaps I had. I sat again at the desk, tracing the faint outline left where the hidden page had once lain. The equations were gone, yet the impression remained, pressed into the wood like scars. My eye caught the edge of the drawer, slightly splintered from years of opening. I pulled it free, and there, lodged behind the frame, lay a scrap no larger than a hand. A fragment of graph paper, folded twice, its creases worn thin. Lewis exhaled heavily, impatient, but I smoothed the fragment beneath the lamplight. Not numbers this time, but words in a careful script. The proof is not in harmony, but in dissonance. I said it aloud, tasting the cadence. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I was not sure, though I was. It was the scholar's final contradiction, a reversal of every book on his shelves, every lecture he had given, a proof not of mathematics but of life or of its refusal. We left the rooms and walked across the quad. Rain began again, soft as breath, falling into the shallow puddles left from the day before. I heard the choir practicing faintly in the chapel, voices blurred by distance. The sound wove itself between the bells, which struck, late as always. For the first time I thought the lateness was deliberate. Someone had tampered with the mechanism, adjusting its rhythm by minutes, forcing dissonance where there should have been order. Lewis muttered that bells were bells and lateness was nothing more than laziness. I told him that mathematics begins with small errors, and small errors lead to collapse. He shook his head, smiling without humour. That night, back in my room, I unfolded the crossword. 23 across irrefutable demonstration 5. I wrote proof, 5 letters, too simple, too absolute. And yet, perhaps, that was all the scholar had wanted, a final word, exact and unyielding, hidden in silence until someone with too much time and too little sleep uncovered it. I poured myself a whiskey and sat listening to the rain. The photograph lay on the table, still sealed in its envelope, the blurred figure at the margin staring from memory rather than sight. The hidden page, the cut leaf, the erased equations, all fragments pointing nowhere certain. Perhaps that was his message, that there is no harmony, only dissonance, no proof, only its pursuit. Lewis asked me, before he left for the night, if I believed we had solved it. I told him the truth, that solutions are for crosswords, not for men. He looked at me strangely, then closed the door behind him with the gentleness of resignation. I remained alone, the bells tolling faintly in the distance, each note followed by silence, each silence longer than the one before. The final proof was not written in numbers or words, but in absence itself. And absence, I thought, is the only certainty Oxford has ever offered me. It ended, as I suppose it had to, with the bells. Oxford has always measured itself by sound, the scrape of chairs in lecture halls, the shuffle of gowns along cloisters, the muted cough in libraries too vast for breathing. But above them all, the bells, steady, late, imperfect, tolling as if they alone remembered what we had forgotten. Lewis and I stood in the quad at dusk, the rain thinning into mist, each stone beneath our feet, slick as though varnished by centuries of sorrow. He asked, almost gently, whether I thought we had reached the truth. I told him that truth was too elusive a word, better left to philosophers. What we had, I said, was resonance. He raised his eyebrows but said nothing more. The tower loomed above us, its silhouette indistinct against a sky bruised by departing light. I remembered the chalked equations, the erased lines, the faint smear of a hand pressed against the window halfway down. The scholar had come here to listen, not to speak. He had searched for patterns in silence, for proof in dissonance. I wondered if he had found it in the bell's belated rhythm, or whether the lateness itself had driven him further into despair. Inside the chapel, the choir rehearsed a hymn, their voices pale against the stone vaulting. A fragment of Latin floated out to us, Dona nobis pacem, grant us peace. The irony was not lost on either of us. Lewis muttered that the boys sang out of tune. I told him perhaps that was the point, dissonance again, where harmony was expected. The master approached, his gown whispering across the stones. He asked if the matter was closed. His voice was courteous, polished, but behind it lay the impatience of a man eager to resume the safety of routine. I said we would close it when the bells rang on time. He looked at me sharply, then laughed too loudly, too quickly, and withdrew into the cloisters. Lewis watched him go and asked what I meant. I told him that lateness was deliberate, a manipulation so slight most would dismiss it. But a scholar, attuned to rhythm, to sequence, would not dismiss it. Each pause, each interval out of place would sound like proof of something amiss. Lewis asked, who would tamper with bells? I said to anyone who wished silence to become unbearable. He exhaled, as though tired of chasing echoes. We waited as the hour approached. The sky had darkened to indigo, the first stars smudging faintly above the spire. When the bell struck, its sound rolled heavy through the air, resonant and slow. 1, 2, 3, and then the pause, longer than natural, as though time itself had stumbled. The scholar had heard that stumble. He had written it down, turned it into numbers, hidden it in pages, folded it in two. Silence. I closed my eyes and listened. The tolling filled the quad, spilled into the streets, carried across the river. Each note decayed into absence, each absence carrying more weight than the sound itself. Back in my room later, I opened the crossword. Last clue, bottom corner, 24 down sound of morning. 4. The answer came without hesitation. 4 letters, a word as final as any verdict. I wrote it in with a hand that did not quite steady itself. Lewis left me to my whiskey and my solitude. He said I thought too much about bells, about silences, about what was missing rather than what remained. Perhaps he was right. Yet as the bells tolled once more across the night, I could not ignore their lateness, their insistence on dissonance. It was less a call to prayer than a reminder of absence. The scholar's death would be recorded as heart failure, his rooms cleared, his name tucked into the footnotes of the college's history. But I knew better, or worse. His final proof was written not in mathematics, but in the tolling of a bell. Late, imperfect, echoing into silence. And silence, as ever, said more than sound.